In this week's video, I'll be showing you how I turn a lump of clay into these finished, fired, ink-dip pens. It's a long process from beginning to end, and these are easily one of the most complicated objects I make, as not only are they rather fiddly things to create, but there are also so many opportunities for things to go wrong along the way. But, as always, this process begins by wedging up a lump of stoneware clay. This is a process that removes any pockets of air that could be inside, and it makes the piece of clay one even, smooth texture throughout. This particular method of preparing the clay is called spiral wedging. The clay is folded and moved in such a way that the spirals beneath the hands become ever smaller and smaller, stretching the clay and forcing out any inconsistencies. Wedging the clay is a vital process for whenever you want to throw on the wheel, and skipping this section or rushing it will only make the task at hand more difficult further along. Once the mass of clay has been wedged sufficiently, I roll it up into a conical shape which is ready to be thrown on the wheel. I slam the whole mass of clay down onto the wheel head, yet I'll only be throwing the very top portion of it, which is a technique called throwing off the hump. That being said, I do centre the entire mass somewhat, as otherwise it can be quite unwieldy. It's also worth noting that for these pens, I prefer to use clay that's a little on the firm side, as they are such delicate things which are very thin and flimsy, especially at this throwing stage. But essentially, throwing off the hump sort of works like a conveyor belt. Once I'm done throwing the piece on top, I can simply push up more clay from below and throw another one, and so on and so forth until there's no clay left whatsoever. Once it's centered to a point I'm happy with, I'll section off a small portion at the top, which is approximately the amount that fits into the palm of my hand. But I don't worry too much when making these ink-dip pens. If they alter in length from one another, or some are a little bit thicker or thinner, I don't mind. I then gradually squeeze the clay upward into a thin rod, making sure, as I'm working, that I always keep one hand supporting it somewhere, whilst the other pushes the clay up. Otherwise, the length of clay has a tendency to spin out of control, and essentially, that's the most difficult part of this process, keeping the whole thing under control, when all this length of clay really wants to do is to fly off to one side. As I throw, I purposefully leave a flared out shape towards the bottom. This provides support for when I remove it from the wheel and set it aside, balanced, to slowly dry out to leather hard. The stick you saw is a simple measure I use, just to make sure they're more or less the right sort of length. I also scrape away the slip from this lower section, revealing drier clay underneath, which will provide me with an area that I'll be able to lift these away from. I then gouge a small undercut, which will guide where I slice my wire through, which is done extraordinarily carefully, as all it takes is one tiny incorrect movement for the length of clay to topple over, which, believe me, has happened a lot over the years. I then very carefully set the thrown pen to one side, which is harder than it looks. Trust me. And you can see there how vital the flared out base was, as without it, there's simply no way they'd stand up on their own. And as all the pen bodies dry out together, I step around the wheel very carefully, as if I knock or bump into the wearboard, and even if it's just the gentlest of knocks, they will just all collapse over, taking each other out like dominoes. This angle may show more clearly the role each hand takes as these are made. They do switch jobs occasionally, but essentially there's always one supporting and one pushing the clay up ever thinner and thinner. The question that often arises about these pieces I make is why throw them at all? Wouldn't it be easier just to hand build them and roll them out from a coil of clay? And the answer is yes. It probably is a bit more straightforward, but I like the challenge, and the fact that they're thrown keeps them more closely in line with the rest of my work, as all of my pieces are thrown on the potter's wheel. With all the difficulties that come along though, the throwing stage is perhaps the easiest, especially once mastered. It's also quite quick, especially compared to the stages that come later on, as at this point all I'm creating are sort of blanks. They're the rough shape which will later be refined further and further. So at this point, if there are throwing rings that are perhaps too prominent, or finger marks and indentations, it isn't the end of the world, as I'll be trimming these and refining them and going over every single surface again. And once I'm happy with the shape, I can carefully remove it and lift it away, balancing it as I go, making sure that my hands stay perfectly steady as I move it from the wheel to the wearboard. Thankfully though, as they are quite thin and the air can get around all of them so easily, they turn leather hard very quickly, and in doing so they become far more rigid, as otherwise I wouldn't be able to place plastic over them like this. And this is how I'll leave them overnight, covered with thin plastic sheeting to keep them from drying out too much before I can finish them the day after. If I left them uncovered overnight, by morning they'd be completely bone dry and useless. And really, so much of making pottery is just monitoring the dryness of your work, as clay always has a certain condition when it's the easiest to work, be it for throwing or trimming or pulling handles. Working on clay when it's in the wrong condition, be it too firm or too soft or too dry for the process at hand, will only ever make your life more difficult, and it's something that's mostly just learnt through experience, as there are so many variables, such as the climate of the country you live in, your studio, the heating or lack of it, drafts, airflow, whether or not the kilns have been on, and even the type of clay that you're using. These are all factors you need to take into account when making pottery. So this is how I leave mine overnight. But if you're a potter too, making pots or attempting these ink dip pens, you may have to do it in an entirely different way. The next morning, I'll very carefully unwrap these, making sure that as I remove the plastic, I don't send any of the pen bodies toppling over, as I really do want these to stay as straight as possible. Clay has a memory, so if I were to bend one of these, unnecessarily so, and even if I were to correct it and straighten it out again, it still could come back to bite me when they're bisque fired and then glaze fired. I then move them over to the wheel to begin the next stage, which is the refinement of these, the trimming of them, the hollowing out of the interiors, and finally turning the tops of them and making sure that they fit nicely onto the rods they'll be fired on. I attach them back to the wheel by brushing some slip into the middle and then rubbing the flared section of the pen into the metal. This sticks it firmly in place, but I also then run my finger over the flare and onto the wheel, sealing the two very securely, as if the pen isn't attached well at this stage, trimming it can be incredibly difficult. When I trim these, I turn the entire length, from top to bottom, and I even turn through most of the flare, which adds some additional length to the pen itself. And once again, as I work, there is always one hand holding the pen in such a way to keep it as straight as possible, because as you can see, as I press the tool in to trim away the clay, the pen has a tendency to lean into the area you're working, so there's a constant battle of back and forth, trimming, straightening, neatening. This stage can take some time, and once again, all it takes is one wrong slip to cause the pen to fly off the wheel, or even just break cleanly in half, as the clay at this stage, while still quite soft, will suddenly rip if the pressure exerted with the tool is too great. Another necessity for this process is sharp tools. Attempting to trim such a delicate piece of clay with blunt trimming tools is exceedingly difficult, and this batch of ink dip pens, which was turned using my sharp bison trimming tools, are the finest and the most delicate pens I've ever made. And once I'm happy with the upper sections of the pen, I'll begin to turn away the lower part. And this is generally how I always work with these. I trim the top and then the bottom, as I need the lower section to support the top. And as you can see as I trim, the length of clay really does bend and move. But those subtle undulations are quite easily corrected with the flat, sharp edge of a metal knife. I try to keep them as straight as possible at this stage, because when I fire them, they inevitably bend just a tiny amount. So if these do develop a significant arch at this point, by the time they're fired, it'll be far more significant. Then, once the entire rod of clay is trimmed and smoothed, it's time to remove it, which is another tricky process. But all I do is gouge one end of the knife underneath and catch it as it comes off. This is just the first step in the trimming process. There's a lot left to do, but first I'll let these dry out for a bit, as trimming them does reveal softer clay that was inside. To trim the tops of these pens, I have a special leather hard chuck, which is kept wrapped in plastic and placed in the seal box. This way I can keep these chucks leather hard for indefinite amounts of time, and I prefer leather hard chucks as they tend to stick to the pieces that are placed on them better than a bone-dried chuck or a bisque-fired chuck might. I can also alter it slightly as I work, which is important for these pens, as I have to constrict the opening in the middle of the chuck so that the pens are held securely in place. And my trick here is I don't center the chuck, but I center the top of the pen. And that might mean that the chuck is slightly off center due to any curvature the pen might have, but at least the pen itself will be centered. And here I just trim away more excess clay from the top, and I neaten up the area where the hole will be drilled. It's only a tiny amount that's removed at this point, just enough to neaten it and prepare it for the next stage, but I do purposefully leave the top to be quite thick, as I want there to be excess clay on the top, so that when I drill the hole, the outsides of the walls simply don't crack. And then, once the hole has been drilled, I go back and I refine the outside of the pen. All I do here though is create a nice flat top, so the drill bit I use to hollow out the inside can go in straight. As you can see, this is really just fingertip work. I bevel this outside edge so there's an obvious section where the hole will be drilled from. And once I've done that to every single pen, I can move on to hollowing out the inside, which needs to be done extremely accurately, as the hole that's created now will shrink as the clay dries and when it's bisque fired and glaze fired. So if I make an error at this stage, the metal ferrule that I'll insert, which holds the pen nib, might not fit. I know that this clay body shrinks 12% from freshly thrown to glaze fired, and I know at this particular leather hard stage I have to use this specific drill bit in order for the metal ferrule to fit once the piece has been fired. And this is how I do the hollowing out. It's very slow, steady work. I keep the metal drill bit still and I rotate the pen around it, making sure as I work to keep both components as in line with each other as possible. So the danger here is having the drill bit go off to one side and either puncturing a hole in the wall or causing it to bulge outward. And it's for this reason, like I mentioned earlier, that I purposefully keep the walls around the hole quite thick and sturdy, and after all these holes have been drilled, I'll go back and refine the top of each pen. This is by far the stage that's the most difficult, as being accurate and keeping the diameter of the hole perfect is essential for how the piece will function once finished. As I drill, I keep a keen eye on the clay that's coming out along the grooves of the drill bit. If it's obviously spiraling out in nice long lengths, then that's a good thing, as it means the clay isn't clogging inside on the drill bit. If I notice it is clogging, I'll simply remove the drill bit, remove the clay, and begin drilling again. The danger is, if you're drilling and the bit clogs up with clay, it'll build up and it can create a bulge, which will deform the length of the pen, and even cause the walls to simply split open. Now, the other factor here is the depth of the hole. So not only am I drilling out enough depth for the metal ferrule to fit into, but I also need to make it deep enough so that the rods these will be fired on can fit about a third of the way up, or more. The rods are what hold the pens in place during the firing, and they're what prevents them from bending over from side to side too much. The last important thing about hollowing them out is that it simply removes excess weight from the rod itself, which makes the finished piece much lighter than it would otherwise be. For these, I know when I've drilled deep enough when the drill bit reaches the section of smooth metal. I then slot the pens over the nichrome rods just to make sure they're the right depth, and I also push them down slightly so that the sharp tips the rods have imprint on the inside of the pen, which makes them easier to balance later on. My system for firing them isn't very complex. I made it myself from a kiln brick and just some thick element wire. And here's a close-up of how they look at this stage. They're a little bit untidy, as you can see, but at least the diameter is correct. Ultimately, this metal ferrule will fit tightly into it. But as you can see at this stage, there's still quite a lot of extra room, which is hugely important, as the clay will shrink down to fit this metal piece perfectly. But there's still one last thing I need to do before these pens can be dried and then bisque fired, and that's to trim this upper section around the hole. The reason I keep these wrapped in plastic most of the time is because I don't want them to dry out too quickly, as given the chance these will turn bone dry in an hour or two. But I also dry them slowly for another reason, and that's so they keep their shape. If they were to be dried too suddenly or unevenly, they can very easily warp and bend. So once completely finished, I keep them wrapped up with plastic and let them dry out very slowly over a week or two. But first, I still need to finish their tops, so I get my pen chuck back out, which is hollow inside, but tapers to a very narrow opening about 2/3 down inside. That way the pen, as it's slotted in, is sort of wedged in place. So I tap center the chuck so it's in the middle of the wheel, and then secure it in place with 3 lumps of clay. I then take the pen, slot it into the chuck, and delicately begin to trim away that squared edge at the top, which is something I can only do now since the hole has been drilled. Once trimmed, I use the pads of my fingers just to burnish and soften that top edge. Here it is from a closer angle. As you can see, I'm sort of squeezing it with my left hand to keep the pen centered, and I just trim away that squared edge the pen had. And then I use my fingertips just to soften that fine edge on top. And if any burrs of clay do make it onto the inside, I just clean it off, although out of view, with the end of the drill bit, which also ensures that the hole is the correct diameter. But here's a before and after that final step, just so you can see how much neater they get. And that's it for the pens at this stage. Now I'll just dry them out very slowly over a couple of weeks while I finish many other pots and prepare for a few gas firings. But before I can do any of that, I need to do some bisque firings in my electric kiln. This is a process that changes what is clay at this point that's bone dry and unbelievably fragile into ceramic as the material undergoes quartz inversion at 573 degrees Celsius. This change is irreversible, and it makes the clay much stronger and also porous, which is a necessary attribute for when they need to be glazed. But for now, I just pack the kiln as tightly as possible with bone dry pots, making sure that the pen bodies themselves are always laid out to be as flat as they can possibly be inside the kiln. It's at this stage that I've probably had the most disasters when creating these pens, as breaking them at this stage is incredibly easy, as they're so fragile and thin. All it takes is a drop from a centimetre or so, and the length will snap. This kiln has a capacity of 200 litres, and it's heated by the elements that are set into the walls. I fire this kiln overnight when I'm not there. It's programmable, unlike my gas kiln, and I can simply set the rate at which it climbs in temperature, which for this firing, it goes to a maximum of 1000 degrees Celsius. You'll be able to notice the subtle colour change in the clay after it's been fired, but all of the pink hues that you can see at this point is just the iron content in the clay body. Once glaze fired, this pink tinge disappears almost completely. And for these bisque firings, I simply pack them as dense as I possibly can, as the more pots I can squeeze in at any one time, the more cost efficient each firing becomes. And kilns actually fire better when there's more inside them, rather than having large expanses of empty air which just need to be heated to 1000 degrees. And this is especially true when it comes to reduction firing in a gas kiln, which is a process that comes a little further down the line. But for now, I just carefully slot the pens into these spaces beneath the bowls and in between vases. I even roll them into place sometimes for those hard to reach areas. Once fully packed, this kiln fires overnight, and usually by the time I'm in the following morning, it's already cooled down to about 450 degrees Celsius. But I don't usually open it until the day after that, when it's cooled down to about 40 degrees. Although if I am in a rush, this process can be expedited, but usually that's not the case. There aren't many rules when packing these bisque kilns. The only one I try to adhere to is to not place the pots on the shelves too close to the elements that are set into the walls, as doing so can cause the elements to wear out more quickly. Otherwise I stack the pots as much as I can, placing cups inside bowls and other vessels into the larger vases. There are some limitations though. I don't like to stack too many bowls in one pile, just in case something goes wrong and they were all to come crashing down. But generally speaking, the pots I make are very light and quite delicate, so the biggest danger during this process is myself, dropping them or bashing two pieces together and having them chip or smash. But once the kiln's full, I can close the lid, choose the correct firing program, and turn it on. A few days later, the kiln's ready to be unpacked. You can see the subtle difference in colour as the pots have become slightly more pink. Most of these pieces will be unpacked and their bases and foot rings will be waxed so that the glaze doesn't adhere to the areas that touch the kiln shelves during the gas firing. The pens, on the other hand, are different. They aren't waxed whatsoever, and they are glazed pretty much entirely, apart from the hollow inside them. But you can see here just how much more brazen I am in the handling of these pots. Previously, when bone dry, I could never stack them like this, but that isn't to say they're very strong, because they aren't. Even if you grip a bisque-fired pot too firmly, it's possible to break them and crack them, especially if they're made thinly. So you do, at this stage, still need to be very careful about how you handle the pots and move them around. The danger with these pens is rolling, so when I store them, I make sure to put a block at each end, just in case I were to place them on an uneven surface. As in the past, I have had 5 or 6 of them simply roll off my workbench straight onto the floor. In college, when I first started to make these, when they were balanced at the throne stage, I created whole sections where no one could walk in the studio, as the movement of the floorboards was enough to move the workbenches and cause the thrown pens to topple over. So making them nowadays in a studio that's all my own is much safer, and I have far fewer breakages, or perhaps I've just had a lot more experience. Once the kiln is totally unpacked, the next task of the day is to mix up a new batch of glaze. I'm using a high feldspar crackle glaze, which contains a lot of potash feldspar, nepheline cyanide, talc, some fluxes, a very small amount of synthetic bone ash, and for the colour, red iron oxide, which appears red now, but once fired, will turn into a deep dark green. I blitz this solution with my 5-gallon mixer, and then sieve all of it through an 80 mesh sieve. As the clay body of the pots is porous, when you dip a piece into the glaze, the water is absorbed into the clay body and it leaves a layer of these raw materials on the outside of the pot. Using different materials will give you different types of surfaces, from glassy to matte to textured. There's a vast spectrum when it comes to glazes, with infinite permutations of material combination combined with using different types of clay and firing methods too. It's certainly a complicated process, but also one of the most fascinating sides of making ceramics. So to glaze these, I simply hold them at each end with one finger, and then submerge them for about 5 or 6 seconds. They're then removed, and I let the excess glaze drip away, as I can't immediately touch them or put them down as the glaze is still wet. I have to hold them and wait until the surface dries enough that I can touch it, so that I can hold it from the middle without damaging the freshly glazed surface. The shaking you see me do here just stops any drips from settling and makes for a cleaner, more even glazed surface. And once I can, I take the pen from the middle, dip the end, and touch up the area around the hollow where the ferrule will go, where my finger was. Then, once those areas have dried, which only takes a moment, I can set them down with the other glazed pens on foam so they aren't damaged. The glazing of these is quite straightforward. I make sure that none of it goes inside the hollow, otherwise it can be a pain to clean out properly. But what's worse, if you aren't able to clean all of that glaze up, there's a chance it'll stick during the firing to the metal rod it's inserted on. But once these have been allowed to fully dry out for a day or so, I'll go over each one, double check them, and I'll clean over the glazed surface to make it as smooth and even as it can possibly be. As the pen bodies dry out, the surface of glaze becomes much more powdery, and for this glaze recipe in particular, it's easier to tidy up when they're at this stage, like you can see them here, although the fine layer of powdery glaze that surrounds them is very fragile, so I make sure not to hit it or chip the glaze away, but essentially I'm just rubbing away any excess drips or any thicknesses and fingerprints, as the neater the pen is at this stage, the better it'll look once fired. As I work, you'll notice beneath me is a basin of water which collects all the excess glaze that comes off during this process. I then use a small wetted paintbrush to clean off the inside and also fettle away about 1 millimeter or 2 of glaze from around the hole, just so there's no risk of the glaze on the outside rolling inward and sticking to the metal during the firing. But this process, the cleaning up of a glazed piece, is always quite a relief, as it's the final physical step of making that can be done to any pot. Thereafter, once fired, they're set in stone. I then take the cleaned up glazed pen and slot it onto its nichrome rod, balancing it as best I can so it isn't leaning slightly in one direction. And here's another pen, this time coated with a white, which is the exact same glaze recipe, just without the red iron oxide. This will fire a sort of grey-white hue. It certainly won't be as vibrant as the white that's seen here, but they'll have a lot more depth, and they'll be covered in tiny speckles of iron, a result of being reduction fired in a gas kiln. So once I've fettled clean the outside surface of the pen, I used a potter's needle just to scrape away a bit more of the excess glaze, before switching to a paintbrush and simply doing what I did before. The white glaze is particularly delicate and is far more powdery and fragile than the red glazes, so I do need to be more gentle as I carefully brush away this small ring of glaze. And now all the pens have been glazed, and hundreds of other pots too, it's time to pack the gas kiln. Once all the pens have been slotted onto the jig, I carefully lift it and carry it over to the kiln before slotting it onto the kiln shelf. The pens wobble and move as I do this, so once positioned, I do need to spend some time rebalancing a few of them. The whole contraption ends up being quite tall, so usually I fire it alongside other bigger pots on the top shelf of the kiln. This kiln is entirely different from the one used previously. Instead of being packed from above, it's packed from the side. But the greatest difference is the energy used to fire the kiln. Whilst the other one was electric, this is fired with natural gas from a main supply. So instead of a chamber simply filled with hot air, when this fires, it's filled with swirling flames. Firing using gas provides you with a whole new range of colours which just aren't quite achievable in an electric kiln. For instance, the same pink glazes you see here in this kiln will fire to deep, dark greens. That's because they're fired in what's called a reduction atmosphere, which I'll go over in greater detail in a moment. But if these same pots were fired in an oxidized atmosphere, like found in an electric kiln, they'd fire into mixed yellow hues that are mottled and not particularly nice. Just like the electric kiln, I pack this one as densely as I possibly can. The only difference is this time is that they cannot touch one another, because if they do, the glaze that surrounds the pieces will melt and fuse them together, which does occasionally happen with my ink dip pens. One, for whatever reason, will slump and fall right into the other, or any other pot that's unlucky enough to be placed around them. Once the kiln is fully packed, I'll step back, double check everything, and then go home, ready to come in early the next day to begin the firing. I begin by lighting all 4 burners with the door open. This is so you aren't potentially igniting a chamber full of gas, which could cause the gas kiln to explode. So it's always lit with the doors open, so there's a lot of ventilation and no accumulation of gas. Once all 4 burners are ignited, the kiln can be sealed and screwed shut. These reduction firings take about 9 hours from start to finish, culminating in a temperature of 1290 degrees Celsius or 2354 Fahrenheit. Every input for firing this kiln is entirely manual, from the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the damper position. But essentially, all I'm doing is slowly firing the kiln up at the beginning, so everything inside is really thoroughly dried out. And as time progresses, I gradually increase the temperature. I check the kiln every 30 minutes and do any adjustments that need to be done in order to keep the kiln's firing schedule on course. Nothing too notable happens during the firing until I hit 860 degrees Celsius. At that point, I initiate reduction by greatly increasing the gas pressure, air pressure, and sliding the dampers that cover the back of the kiln's flues to half closed. This causes the atmosphere inside to change drastically. The burning fuel inside the kiln no longer has enough oxygen to burn efficiently with. To put it simply, we're trying to create an atmosphere that's void of oxygen inside the kiln, as doing so causes the fuel that's burning inside to reach into the clay and glazes themselves and strip away oxygen molecules from iron molecules, which in turn creates the green hues and the scattering of iron flecks that cover pots that are reduction fired, depending on what type of clay you're using, of course. Once the reduction has been started, I keep it going right up until the end of the firing. It's a loud, hot process, and through these spy holes in the door I can look at pyrometric cones that I've positioned amongst the pots, and by observing how far bent over they are, I know when it's time to finish the firing. Which is always a relieving moment as you're met with silence. This is a view through the spy holes in the door, and you can just about see the arched back of the pyrometric cones, which were the indicators of the heat work done inside the kiln during the firing. This is now a few days later, The kiln has cooled all the way down to 150 degrees Celsius, and at this point I can crack the door open. This is always a very anxious moment, as really, you haven't been able to see anything happening inside this entire time. The pots are locked away and bathed in flames, and it's only at this moment that you find out whether everything went according to plan or not. The colour changes stark, as the pots are now white and green and covered in glass that's coated over clay that's as hard as stone. Once I get to the pens, I can reach inside and remove the entire brick with all of them standing upright, thankfully with no casualties this time round. The pens can then be removed and are placed somewhere safe, where they can't roll and smash onto the floor. You can see how some have leaned over very slightly, which adds a little arc to them, which I don't mind. It's a mark of the process and the firing they've been through. And recently I fired probably the most of these I ever have in consecutive firings, some 45 in total, and each will be paired with a matching inkwell. I'll include a link on screen now and in the description below to a video that shows how I make those. But the final step for these is to have their metal ferrules fitted and a nib chosen and inserted. The ferrules go in quite easily. Generally, I think these metal pieces are produced for wooden inkjet pens. They have a little metal spike that pokes out of the ferrule, I think, so that when you insert it into the wood, it's locked in place. Ceramic, on the other hand, has no give, so the spike actually stops it from going in altogether. So I simply sand it away and squeeze the ferrule to be a bit tighter, if needs be, until it fits in. Sometimes they can be a bit tight, but I figure it's better they're more secure, rather than being loose and not fitting at all. Once the ferrule's in, I look through all my antique pen nibs, which I've been collecting for a long time now, until I find one that I like and matches the pen. But they are, of course, customizable too. The nibs can be removed and replaced with all kinds of different shapes. These are one of those objects which have taken me years to figure out how's best to make them, and I'm sure I still haven't figured out the most efficient way, but I enjoy the process. They're really a labour of love. I can find them challenging to put together, but once all the pieces work and come together, and I have the pen, the inkwell, the pen rest, and the cork, it's really special. The only thing this video is really missing is a demonstration of them in use, but for that I need to find someone with really beautiful handwriting to send one to. I suppose there's some kind of romanticism too with objects like these, as writing by hand and doing calligraphy becomes a skill that less and less people are capable of. These are tools, essentially, and I've always had the opinion that when you have beautiful tools that work and are handmade, the end products those help you create become even more meaningful, and you have more of a connection to the tools and the process itself. After all, the reason I started making these in the first place is because draftsmanship and design was such a big part of my creation process when making pottery. And here they are with their matching sets, the pen and their rest and the inkwell together. Thanks so much for watching, if you've made it this far, and if you'd like to see how these inkwells are made, I'll leave a link to that video down in the description below.